Welcome trainees. Today, we are going to learn about the topic of gauges. Let's see the objectives of the topic. The first is state the types and their uses, and the next is state the care and maintenance of gauges. Now see the introduction for gauges. A gauge can be described as a device for measuring a physical quantity, for example, to determine thickness, gap in space, diameter of materials, or pressure of flow. There are many types of gauges, but here, we are going to see about 3 types only. The first one is radius and fillet gauge. The second one is feeler gauge. And the third one is hole gauge. Now, see the types, one by one. First, see the definition for radius and fillet gauge. Components are machined to have curved formation on the edges, or at the junction of 2 steps. Accordingly they are called radius and fillets. The size of the radius is normally provided on a drawing. The gauges used to check the radius, formed on the edges, are called radius gauges, and the gauges used to check the fillets are called fillet gauges. After the definition, we can see the types and their uses. The application of radius gauge is to check the radius formed externally. The application of a fillet gauge is to check the fillet formed on a turned component. Checking the corner radius of a part being filed to shape. Checking a radius formed by a milling cutter. Some sets have provisions to check the radius and fillet on each blade. And some sets have separate sets of blades to check the radius and fillet. Each blade can be swung out of the holder separately and has its size engraved on it. Individual gauges are also available. They usually have internal and external radii on each gauge, and are made in sizes from 1 to 100 mm, in steps of 1 mm. For better efficiency in gauges, we need more care and maintenance. Let's see the care and maintenance for radius gauge. Radius gauges can be covered in an oil-based spray as a preventive measure against rust during storage. If a radius gauge becomes rusty, the folding mechanism may seize up. Further problems include the compromised accuracy of the gauge's measurement. The second type is the feeler gauge. Let's see the definition for feeler gauge. A feeler gauge consists of a number of hardened and tempered steel blades of various thicknesses, mounted in a steel case. The thickness of individual leaves is marked on it. Let's see the BIS set for feeler gauge. The Indian standard establishes 4 sets of feeler gauges, numbers 1, 2, 3 and 4, which differ by the number of blades in each, and by the range of thickness. Minimum is 0.03 mm to 1 mm, in steps of 0.01 mm. The length of the blade is usually 100 mm. Next, see about the uses of feeler gauge. To check the gap between the mating parts. To check and set the spark plug gaps. To set the clearance between the fixture, setting block, and the cutter tool for machining the jobs. To check and measure the bearing clearance and for many other purposes, where a specified clearance must be maintained. After the uses, we can see about care and maintenance of feeler gauge. Feeler gauges should be cleaned with an oily cloth before storage to prevent rust. Wonky Donkey recommends that you keep the blades closed at all times, other than when in actual use, to prevent damage. That is open, measure, close. And the third type is hole gauge. Hole gauges are used for measuring the sizes of holes. Let's see the types of hole gauges. There are two types of hole gauges: telescopic hole gauge and small hole gauge. Now see about the first type, telescopic hole gauge. Telescopic gauges are popular for fine work, as they are very rigid and have a better feel. Let's go for the construction of telescopic gauge. Telescopic gauges are T-shaped. They consist of a pair of telescopic legs, or plungers connected to a handle. The plungers are spring-loaded to force them apart. After inserting the gauge in a hole or slot, it can be locked in position by turning the knurled handle. The uses of telescopic gauge are used for measuring the sizes of holes, slots, and recesses. Telescopic gauges are available in a set of 6 numbers to measure holes from 8 mm to 150 mm. The second type is small hole gauge. Telescopic gauges are not suitable for measuring holes below 9 mm. For measuring smaller holes and slots, small hole gauges are used. Now see the construction for small hole gauge. A small hole gauge consists of a tube having holes on the opposite sides. At one end where hardened balls are fixed, the other end of the tube has an external thread. A screwed thimble is fixed with the threaded tube. A plunger with a tapered end and spring-loaded is inserted in the tube and tightened with the screwed thimble. At the end of the thimble, a knurled handle is fitted. While rotating the knurled handle in a clockwise direction, the plunger moves forward up and pushes the balls out to contact the surfaces. Let's see about uses of small hole gauge. A small hole gauge is an instrument used for indirect measurement, while a micrometer is usually used for measuring the sizes directly. Small hole gauges are available in a set of 4 numbers to measure holes from 3 mm to 13 mm. After the uses, we can see the care and maintenance of small hole gauges. Coat metal parts of small hole gauges with a light film oil to prevent rust. Store gauges in separate containers. Keep graduation and markings clean and legible. Do not drop small hole gauges. Small nicks and scratches will result in inaccurate measurement. For the remembrance of gauges topic, we are trying to answer one question. The question is, what is the name of this gauge? The options are A. Hole gauge, B. Radius gauge, C. Feeler gauge, D. Dial gauge. The answer is C. Feeler gauge. Hope all are getting some information about gauges. With this, gauges topic is over. I will be back with another interested topic. Thank you.